and agri-college engines. In this component, we're going to provide an overview of engine assembly processes. Safety concerns for this will be same as usual when working on an engine. Heavy components, sharp edges from the edges of machine surfaces, and pinch points, particularly in and around the crankshaft. For this section, there are a few special tools you'll need. The crankshaft socket again for rotating the crankshaft. A piston hammer is probably the best tool to use to insert pistons. We have two different styles of piston ring compressor. One is a plier type, where you have a ratcheting plier and a band, and the other is a tapered sleeve. Either one will work, and we'll demonstrate both of them during the assembly process. You'll need two torque wrenches. For connecting rods and smaller fasteners, you'll need a 3/8 drive torque wrench. And for larger things like main caps and cylinder head bolts, you'll need the 1/2-inch drive torque wrench. To demonstrate the camshaft installation, as with virtually all engine assembly processes, we want to make sure we have all the surfaces where we have metal-to-metal contact properly lubricated before assembling. Also, when placing the cam in the engine, we want to make sure we don't damage any of the camshaft bearings. Every time you install a component in an engine, you want to check it for proper operation before you move on to the next step. In this case, we're going to check to make sure the camshaft rotates freely. The rear cam cover is just sealed using a RTB sealant. In this case we have Permatex Ultra Black. We just need to put a small bead and a ring around that and install it on a clean, dry surface at the back of the engine. So the bead size needed for this is quite small. And as always, when you're done, make sure you release the pressure on the gun so we don't have a mess at the tip. And we install the cover over the back of the cam. Hi, in this section we're going to demonstrate laying in the crank. There's several little details that need to have some special attention. If we look at our main bearings, you'll find that you have grooved mains. These can go in this, and this location. They're all the same for these spots. Process is relatively straightforward. Line up the tab on a bearing with the notch in the block. Press it in, rock it back and forth. It should be a snug fit in that bore. If we look at this bearing, you'll see it has size on it. That's our thrust bearing. This bearing has to go in a particular location. And in this case, it's main number 1, 2, 3, 4 that is our thrust bearing. Okay, so the installation of this is similar. Make sure it's seated properly. Okay, and that is going to prevent the crankshaft from moving back and forth too much. The center main, you'll notice, does not have a groove in it. In this particular engine design, the center main does not feed oil into the rods. They're fed off of these 4. So your center main is ungrooved. Okay. Put the remaining bearing shells in place. Make sure they're seated properly. Okay. And apply some oil for lubrication. As always, we never put engine components together dry. We make sure we have lube on everything. And on the thrust bearing, you make sure you have it on the sides as well. Our crankshaft is cleaned and prepped. We'll just need a little bit of oil on the mains. And again, here on number 4, we make sure that because this is our thrust bearing, we get oil on the sides as well. And we want to make sure we have oil on the area where the rear beam seal will run. Take the crankshaft, set it straight down into the engine block, like that. Make sure we have free rotation. And then we'll go to our main caps. Okay, the process with the main caps is very similar to the bearings themselves. We've got them inserted, tabs lined up. When we put the caps on, we need to make sure that the tab here is on the same side as the tab in the block. That is the way all of these are set up. And it needs to go that way. Alright, our thrust bearing, again on number 4 location. If you remember, our caps were numbered. This one's number 1. So number 1 goes at the front of the engine. Tab, tab. Okay, we follow a similar procedure for all of them. The only one that's different in any significant way is going to be our rear main. The rear main has a seal. We're going to install the seal. Notice the seal lip faces in towards the engine. Okay, we're going to install that seal. Just lift the crankshaft up a little bit, makes it a little easier. Okay, the seal goes in and sits against a little ledge. Now we have an oil passage here. If you remember your oil pump mounted on the top here, it actually pumps oil down from the cap into the engine block. And this is also, if any oil leakage occurs here, it's external. You'll see it at the back of the engine. So we want to put some sealant on this. We're going to use, this is similar to pipe sealant. We're going to just put a very small amount on here. We want to make sure we go around that oil hole and just a little bit across the back so that we don't have oil weep out here. Okay, and then, oops, sorry, almost forgot to put lube on that bearing. Okay. Your rear main cap goes on. Okay, we'll continue the installation of the rest of the main caps in order, aligned properly. When we put the bolts in, we need to make sure we have oil under the head of the bolt and oil on the thread of the bolt. They're inserted like that. Okay, and it'll be a similar process for all of them. There's one other detail before the caps are tightened up. This thrust bearing cap, it can move a slight amount back and forth. Before we tighten this down, we use a pry bar and we gently pry the crankshaft forward and backwards in order to center this cap before we finish tightening it. That will prevent a misalignment, having the bottom end of the bearing here and the top end here. So we center them before we clamp it in place. We're going to demonstrate the installation of a piston and rod assembly here. As noted in the setup, there's two different sets of tools you can use for doing this. So we're going to run through it once with each tool. Okay, so we'll start off with the ratcheting pliers and the band. Okay, we have our piston, bores, everything all lubricated and set up. We set the crankshaft with the rod journal at the bottom dead center position. That gives us the most wiggle room for accessing everything. We want the piston rings lined up according to the specification. And we take the band clamp. If you look at it, you'll see that there is a top and a bottom. Right here it says bottom. The bottom is the side that goes against the engine. All right. So we take it, set it up like that. We look at the piston. The piston in this case has a mark with an arrow. It has a number 1 on it, so we know it goes at this end of the engine block. If you don't have marks on the piston, you also have, in this particular case, you have a notch, or sorry, a bump on the back side of the connecting rod. So this part of the connecting rod goes towards the back, arrow goes towards the front, so you should be able to orient this correctly. So set that in the bore like that. We'll put our clamp on like that. Okay, it's always nice to have an assistant guide the connecting rod onto the crank journal. Okay, so I've got this set down like that with that snug. Okay, and it looks like it's oriented correctly, and I tap it down. Okay, so our assistant's got that lined up properly. The rod cap is already lubricated. In this particular case, you remember that the rod cap nuts are a 13mm 12 point. So that's the socket you would use to put it on. Also, you need to remember that the bearing tabs on the rod caps and the top half of the rod bearing need to line up the same way as the main bearing inserts did. Okay, we can go ahead and snug that up. Okay, that pulled down nicely. All right, so we want to make sure that that rotates freely. You will find that there's added friction now because you have the piston rings do have quite a significant amount of friction against the cylinder walls, but it should rotate smoothly, no catches, no binding. Okay, we're going to demonstrate how to use a tapered ring to install the pistons. We've rotated the crankshaft around so the number 2 rod journal is at the bottom. We have the number 2 piston and rod assembly right here. Again, we have the orientation correct, arrow to the front, tab on the rod to the back, number 2 cylinder. This is similar, but a little bit different. We've got our piston rings lubricated and aligned correctly, and it's usually worthwhile with this tool doing a little bit of wiggling and aligning. It is possible when using this, if you just kind of jam it together, when you put the piston rod assembly into the taper, you can catch things quite misaligned and it'll just jam inside the tool. So if we kind of start things by hand, generally we can get the alignment correct. All right, and we'll insert it. Again, we've got an assistant at the bottom end to make sure things go in the correct location. Okay, and we just tap it in. Okay, so we'll get the rod cap installed and snugged with the 13mm 12-point socket, and we'll verify that engine rotation is free, nothing binds, anything like that, and we'll continue the process for the remaining cylinders. After all the connecting rods are installed, torque them to specification. Apply sealant to the oil pump outlet hole before installing it. Before you can install the timing chain tensioner, you need to compress it. This is probably most easily done by 2 people. One to compress the spring, the other to install a retaining pin. In this case, we're using an Allen key to retain the tensioner. Before we proceed with the installation of the timing chain, we should review the process. Ideally, you'll end up with the center line of the crankshaft, the timing mark on the crank gear, and the tooth that it indicates lined up with the tab on the tensioner, and the opposite tab on the tensioner lined up with the indicated tooth on the cam gear, along with the cam timing mark and the center line of the camshaft, all in an exactly straight line. The reality is, when you actually do this, you'll find that there's very slight misalignment. Here we've indicated it with these red dots. This is actually properly installed. What you're looking at is basically just production tolerances. The key thing here is that you were within 1 tooth. There's no way in this particular setup to get it closer than that. Now attach the timing cover, taking care to align it properly on its locating dowels. When we go to reinstall the oil pan, there's a significant cavity around the rear main cap that we need to fill with sealant. What we need to do is inject, once the surfaces are clean and dry, is inject some sealant down into both sides of the cap, at the base where it meets the engine block. Then we'll fill the cavity with the sealant. On the pan, we're going to do a continuous bead all the way around on the inside of the bolt holes. When you've finished installing the pan, you should see a small amount of sealant squished out all the way around. This is a good indication that you've got enough in there. Just leave it alone and it'll cure nicely. You can now roll the engine over and install several of the smaller external parts. You can start with the oil pump drive. As always, when you have mechanically contacting components, you want to make sure anywhere that's going to wear is lubricated, so you'll apply oil to the gear drive and at the bearing at the bottom of the oil pump drive itself. Note that you have to engage both the oil pump drive shaft and the cam gear with this unit. You can also apply a little bit of oil to the cam and crankshaft sensor O-rings and a little bit into their mounting holes. Once you've got them lubricated, just a little bit of pressure and a little wiggle and they should pop into place. All of these components are retained by a single bolt each. We can now install the accessory drive flange. We're going to use the same puller as we used to take it off. We're just going to assemble it a little bit differently. We'll have to select the adapter that matches the crankshaft bolt and assemble the puller with the bearing in the opposite way so we can use it to push the drive flange into place. On the drive flange itself, we want to do a couple of things. One, apply some sealant to the inside of the flange where it presses onto the crankshaft to prevent oil from weeping out. We're going to focus on the key area and just put a little smear of it around the inside bore. On the outside where the flange would run on the front cover seal, we want to make sure we have a coating of oil on it so we don't damage the seal on startup. You can now lubricate the valve lifter bores in the engine block to prepare for the installation of the lifters themselves. Note that they are roller lifters, therefore they're directional, and they need to be installed so that the roller follows the rotation of the camshaft. Once all the lifters are in place, you can install the lifter guides. If you look closely, you'll see that they have a bump on one side of them. That bump has to go towards the engine cylinders. Once they're in place, they're retained by one bolt each. After the lifter guides are bolted in place, you can install the cylinder head dowels. Ensure both the cylinder block deck surface and the head gasket are clean and dry. Check the orientation of the gasket and install it. You can now place the cylinder head onto the deck surface. Try to visually line it up with the dowels and then set it into place. You want to avoid scratching the gasket when you're installing the cylinder head bolts. Make sure that you lubricate not only the threads but under the head of the bolt itself. This will help make the torquing procedure more accurate. Torque the head bolts in the correct sequence and using the correct technique. You should use a torque angle gauge for the last step of the procedure. You can now install the push rods and rocker arms. Make sure you lubricate anywhere where you'll have metal to metal contact. And note when you are snugging down the rocker arms that they do have a key underneath them that has to line up with a groove in the cylinder head itself. After you've added oil, you can go ahead and prime the engine. While the engine is spinning, you have a couple of things to look for. One, you should build oil pressure and start to see oil flow out the rocker arms near the top of the engine, and you should feel compression at each spark plug hole. After you have a successful prime and compression check, you can go ahead and finish buttoning up the top end of the engine. Make sure your valve cover gasket is in place correctly in the cover itself. Check the alignment of the crankcase ventilation hole on the cylinder head and install the valve cover. You've now completed all of the main assembly processes for your engine project. All that remains is to install the required manifolding, get the engine mounted in the run stand, fire it up, and check out your work.